is co-chaired of the Charity Security Network and Human Security Collective, who are co-chairing the NPO coalition on FATF. And this coalition has been engaging over the past years to ensure that NPOs and philanthropic organizations engage more around the development and implementation of counterterrorism and money laundering policy. I would now like to first give you a little bit of an overview why this issue matters. I'll dive directly into the presentation of the introduction, and then we can have questions and answers later on in the webinar. So first of all, we've seen over the past years that the space for civil society and the space for philanthropy is changing. There is an increasing trend of restrictions on NPOs and philanthropy, and this is happening globally. It's also happening in Europe, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in Asia, in America and Central America. So this really is a global trend. It was evidenced by Civicus data and also by ICNL data more recently. So we see different types of restrictions being introduced. We see that there are even suspensions happening on the NPO sector. We certainly see a trend towards more foreign funding restrictions. It's becoming more difficult to channel also philanthropic funding across the borders. We also see more burdensome registration requirements and reporting requirements which are imposed on the NPO and on the philanthropic sector. So this is an overall global trend that has been observed over the past years. And when we look at the motivations of why governments have been introducing these types of restrictions, there is of course different sets of motivations, and sometimes it's a combination of different ones. So sometimes governments are concerned about civil unrest. They don't like a very vibrant civil society in their country. There are also sovereignty arguments used by some governments when introducing stricter controls or restrictions on foreign funding issues. Now, the topic of today will focus on one other kind of motivation for governments to introduce certain rules on the NPO sector and on the philanthropic sector that are specifically security concerns. Many governments around the world are concerned about tax crime, money laundering, and financing of terrorism. And this kind of overall policy has led to restrictions on our sector. The key international policy setter around money laundering and financing of terrorism is the Financial Action Task Force. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Financial Action Task Force. I'll just give you a very brief kind of summary of what the Financial Task Force is. It was created in 1989 at the G7 summit. It's an intergovernmental body currently composed of 36 members. And its original mandate was focusing on money laundering and tax evasion. It then was extended to the financing of terrorism after the attacks of 9/11. While the members are around 36, it is a policy that is implemented by over 190 countries worldwide. So all these countries have committed to implement the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, recommendations. The Financial Action Task Force has, in the meantime, issued 40 recommendations in the named policy areas, and it is ensuring that these policies are implemented through a system of evaluations. So there are country evaluations happening all over the world on how the governments are doing in implementing these FATF recommendations. And clearly the governments want to score well. They want to be compliant in implementing the recommendations, because non-compliance has negative impact on the countries. So we see here that FATF is not a legislator. It issues these recommendations, but it is very powerful because it's really a global standard setter, and it has a very effective tool to check out on implementation. Of these 40 recommendations, one recommendation specifically addresses our sector, the NPO sector. And the old recommendation 8, which was just changed very recently, had singled out the NPOs to be particularly vulnerable for abuse of terrorism financing. And kind of this wording of the old recommendation led to some overregulation happening in countries. And also, to some extent, overregulation was caused and is still caused by incorrect implementation of this recommendation. So we at European Foundation Center, we are part of this global NPO coalition, which has engaged over the past years quite closely with the Financial Action Task Force, with the Secretariat, with the different presidencies, to see to change the policy and to ensure appropriate implementation of the policy. So we have been also pushing for a more formalized dialogue with the Financial Action Task Force, which now led to a more formalized dialogue and 4 seats for the NPO sector in one of the major consultative fora of the FATF. The big breakthrough, of course, has been the change of the recommendation 8. So as I said earlier on, the old recommendation 8, and you see it here on the slide, it's highlighted in red. The old recommendation was singling out non-profit organizations as particularly vulnerable and that countries should ensure that they cannot be misused. Now, this was changed in 2016, and it is now really stressing that countries should apply a risk-based approach. So with the new recommendation 8 of the Financial Action Task Force, countries should now review the adequacy of laws and regulation that relate to NPOs, which the country has identified as being vulnerable to terrorism financing abuse. Countries should apply focused and proportionate measures in line with the risk-based approach to protect these organizations from terrorism financing abuse. So as you can see in the new wording, it really has a risk-based approach, and in the following slide I want to illustrate what actually are then the measures, or how do countries go about implementing recommendation 8, what are the steps that they need to undertake. First of all the countries that are implementing recommendation 8 should conduct a risk assessment of the NPO sector. So they should look at their entire NPO sector and then find out which parts of the NPO sector are potentially at risk for terrorism financing abuse. They should review the existing laws and regulations. Here I specifically want to stress that it's about hard law as well as soft law approaches, and check out if the existing laws and regulations and rules already address potential risks. And then only the third step, when there are gaps found and identified, then there should be measures introduced to address these remaining risks. And clearly these measures should be proportionate to the identified risks. And as a fourth step, of course, the measures that are introduced by governments should be in line with international human rights and humanitarian law standards. So as I said earlier, the governments have to undertake a risk-based approach, and it's not the entire NPO universe that is covered by the FATF recommendation 8. So if you look at the slide where you have the entire NPO universe, and then you have, first of all, those NPOs that are falling under the definition of the Financial Action Task Force, and then from those that fall under the definition, as a next step, you have those NPOs that are likely to be at risk of terrorism financing abuse. And it's really only this portion of the NPO sector that the countries should focus on. As I said earlier, the country evaluations that are undertaken by the FATF and by FATF regional style bodies are a very effective tool to ensure that the policy recommendations are implemented. So All the countries are evaluated either through a peer review by FATF member states or through FATF regional style bodies, and there are a lot of them. As I said also, governments want to score well, and they are facing otherwise political pressure, higher risk ratings, or in extreme cases even sanctions. If you want to know when your respective country is up for FATF evaluation, for country evaluation, you can check on the FATF website. There is a specific calendar that lists all the upcoming evaluations, and you can check out when your country is up for FATF evaluation. Now, the FATF mutual evaluation process is quite a long process. It's an over a 1-year process, and there is one slide describing the process. I will not have time to go into details of all the different stages of this process. What I want to highlight here is that in the 3rd round of country evaluations, the focus really was only on technical compliance. And in the 4th round of evaluations, which is happening now, there is also what is called a so-called effectiveness check. So it's not only that the evaluators are checking whether there is technical compliance with the standard, they are also checking if the measures that the governments have been introduced are actually effective measures. So that's an interesting addition which has also changed the evaluation system and methodology of FATF. Within a specific project of core members of the NPO coalition, we have analyzed over the past years how the FATF evaluations were going ahead, how the NPO sectors were engaged in the process, because indeed the governments have to reach out and engage with the NPO sector throughout the implementation of the FATF policy. And here we have summarized a little bit the key findings of the research project. And what we found out is that in the majority, or in several cases, the governments did not reach out to their NPO sector. They did not reach out in the risk assessment process, neither before the evaluators came into the country to check out how the implementation was going, nor after. So NPOs were in many cases not aware that the FATF evaluation was going on. They were not aware that evaluators were coming to an on-site visit to their country, and they were not sure how to get involved. Basically, it was not a very transparent process in many cases, so the NPOs really had no clue that the evaluation was going on. Another item that was mentioned by those countries that recently undergone an evaluation was that the evaluators, through the peer review or through the regional bodies review, that the evaluators, they had to evaluate all 40 recommendations, which is a wider scope of issues covered, and only one of them specifically targeting NPOs. So the evaluators were not necessarily NPO experts, and of course they did come with their own, and they do come with their own legal systems and traditions. So this was also found to be slightly challenging. On the other hand, it also allows an actual, neutral and distant review and of the own policy in this regard. What also was said that there was a feeling sometimes of during the on-site visit when the NPOs engaged in a conversation with the evaluators, that it was a little bit talking into a box. You were asked certain questions and you answered them as an NPO representative, but there was not a real follow-up. There was no report written, of course, directly from this meeting, so you did not know as an NPO participating in the on-site visit whether actually your input was taken into account. We have also done a little bit of analysis. What are the questions that are generally asked during the on-site visit by the country evaluations? So basically, the evaluators want to know if you yourself consider your NPO sector of being vulnerable or at risk for terrorism financing. What have you done as a sector also to address certain vulnerabilities? Is there some kind of self-regulation? How do you ensure that money that you actually are spending outside your country and cross-border is spent properly? And is there information guidance given by the government, the regulatory authority, regarding the potential risk and how to address potential risks for terrorism financing? They also want to know if you were involved in the process and to what extent your government is applying measures, proportionate measures, to address certain risks. And then there were also open questions about if you have any ideas of how the government could potentially further improve the fight against terrorism financing. So in the following, we would like to now move to more country-specific experience around the FATF evaluations. And I have just picked two countries, which is now Norway and then Belgium, to illustrate a little bit that the results of the report, of the FATF evaluation report, they are not necessarily based on requiring hard law regulation. So in the case of Norway, for example, you have a country with a long tradition of NPOs in the country, but not very regulated. So there is not much hard law regulation, for example, on associations. And the meeting with the evaluators also addressed these questions, but the sector representatives, the Norwegian sector representatives, during the on-site visit, they were able to kind of explain that indeed control can also be provided by the NPO sector itself through either self-regulation or by kind of running transparent organizations as a mechanism to prevent certain risks. So in the end, Norway got largely compliant with regards to recommendation 8. Then with regards to the evaluation of Belgium, and there myself, I was also, as the European Foundation Center, participating in the on-site visit in the country evaluation. Indeed, Belgium also has a long tradition of NPOs, but it also has not very detailed regulation on smaller associations in particular. We, as sector, shared some information on our own hard laws and on soft laws. However, retroactively, we can conclude that we could have potentially put some more effort into doing our own risk analysis of the sector. So here, the sector could have been even better prepared for the on-site visit and the conversation with the evaluators. So I would now like to invite my colleagues in this webinar who have kindly agreed to share their country-specific situations and experience with the FATF policy and FATF country evaluations to share their experience. And I would like to start with Natalie Ross from the Council on Foundations in the US. And she will explain briefly to you how the FATF evaluation in the US happened and how they engaged as an organization in this process.
Hi, thank you, Hannah. It's great to speak with all of you from very early morning here in the United States. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience working with our partners in the United States around the FATF evaluation that started in 2015 and concluded in 2016. And so if we move to the next slide, our FATF evaluation really started before the revision of Recommendation 8 that Hanna was talking about. And so the U.S. was evaluated under the old Recommendation 8, which means it was not evaluated under the risk-based approach. As an organization, we really did 4 main things to engage in the evaluation as it happened over that year. So first, we worked as a coalition of partners, and that was incredibly important. As a philanthropy network, our members, which are foundations, have specific concerns around FATF-related challenges that are represented in U.S. law that really inhibits their ability to make international grants and to work on even certain issues domestically. other organizations in the United States, service delivery organizations and other types of nonprofits, have different concerns around FATF. And so we joined a coalition with the Charity and Security Network to ensure that philanthropy's voice was represented in the nonprofit engagement around the FATF evaluation. Leading up to the evaluation, we regularly engaged both globally FATF officials and the U.S. Treasury officials who serve on FATF and are very engaged in the process. And that was incredibly important. The Charity and Security Network and the Council work globally on FATF and have a long history of talking to U.S. Treasury. So the fact that those relationships already existed were incredibly helpful when the time for the evaluation came up. Leading up to the evaluation, we did draft a memo noting concerns that the PSO sector has in the United States around anti-money laundering laws and other counterterrorism financing challenges. As the Council, we solicited input from our members to draft these comments and sent them directly to FATF 6 months before the evaluation began. And most importantly, we made the case that we felt the laws as they were currently set in the United States are over-regulation of our sector, which impedes their effectiveness in helping achieve the outcomes that FATF wants. So they are too restrictive of nonprofits and really hurt our work. And then finally, we also engaged in the on-site visit that happened during the evaluation. Unlike some other examples, during that evaluation, there were no meetings with umbrella groups like the Council or Charity Security Network or others. There were 3 unnamed service organizations that were visited, but we don't know who those were, and FATF did not agree to release those names. So if we go to the next slide, the evaluation outcome was that the U.S. is partially compliant. Again, looking at old Recommendation 8, they found that in the U.S., most terrorist financing threats do not include the nonprofit sector. They found that the U.S. government regulation of the nonprofit sector is risk-based. Our coalition does not agree with that and feels strongly that it is not a risk-based approach. That's a continued area of advocacy that we have with FATF, but also with U.S. Treasury officials. And the main takeaway really was that there is a tension between liability within the law and taking a risk-based approach, which does create problems for NPOs. And we in the U.S. find that especially in the banking services sector. And so that's a significant concern that we continue to track. So if we go to the next slide, I really wanted to highlight 3 things that we learned about this evaluation process that we think would be relevant for other countries supporting evaluation. So 1, it's important to realize that information should be sent to FATF at least 6 months prior to the evaluation's on-site visit. And that timing is important, as they're doing it so that they have the information while they're working on the scoping paper. And as Hanna showed in the process, it's a complicated timeline for all the steps in the evaluation. So knowing that time frame of 6 months before they arrive is important. So don't wait for them to arrive in country before you start engaging. And that goes the same with maintaining that relationship with both FATF and the Treasury representatives. Secondly, we did submit comments during the scoping exercise. However, FATF was unhappy with those comments. They thought that they were too long. We were trying to be as inclusive as possible of concerns that we heard from a range of different nonprofit actors in the United States. But they're requesting that they followed immediate outcome 10 criteria. At that time, there was not a template for that. So as a learning out of our process, our partner, the Charity and Security Network, is developing a report template that other countries could use as they submit comments to FATF leading up to their evaluation. And finally, as I mentioned, we had a real lack of transparency around which selected NPOs were engaged during the site visit. FATF reported that they could not share names of the contacted organizations. However, it was important that throughout the process we notified FATF and the evaluators that we were not seeing the outreach to NPOs during the risk assessment process. And so we continued that line of communication to make clear that we thought there was not enough engagement and that we found the engagement that did happen untransparent. In the end, we have continued our work engaging around the findings both of the evaluation, but also with the transition of Recommendation 8 in the United States. Obviously, our evaluation was under the old Recommendation 8. So under the new Recommendation 8, there's additional areas for advocacy around how the laws in the U.S. could change to better enable the work of the nonprofit sector. So that was our experience. Thanks for asking me to share.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. That was very, very interesting, and to learn also about kind of the lack of possibility to engage in the on-site visit, and that you were not even able to identify or find out who the NPOs were that were actually around the table. I mean, the process that we had in Belgium was very different. The government was doing a lot of outreach and was very open and preparing us even for and briefing us even for the on-site visit. So we can see that countries do approach this very differently. So now we'd like to move to the next country case study, which will be presented by Isabel Peñalosa from the Spanish Association of Foundations. And without further ado, I pass on the floor to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Hanna. Hello to everybody. Well, I would like to explain not only the Spanish evaluation, but also the consequence of FATF recommendation of our regulation and internal situation. Well, in order to explain Spain FATF evaluation, we have to start with the act that was approved in 2010 in our country, which obliged to preserve registries with the identity of donors, individuals or corporations giving money or resources, and beneficiaries, but that means that we have to identify formal beneficiaries and formal donors, but as well as the real owner of these donors, which means or implies a high degree of compliance and self-regulation tool in the non-profit sector. It doesn't mean that we have to do public those lists of or data about the donors or beneficiaries, but we have to count on the information at the disposal of public authorities. Then in 2010, well, some problems and mainly some doubts in the application arise quickly at the beginning. Questions like who is the owner of a donor, for example, in other non-profits or public benefit foundations which do not have property structures, if all the due diligence measures should be in the same degree for non-profit working in developing countries or in Spain or in risk countries. I mean, it was like a tabula rasa, and there was not a difference between different non-profit organizations. At the same time, we didn't know if we have to identify all the donations, what to do with little amounts, if we have to take a special measure with fundraising campaigns, etc., etc. So from the beginning, the non-profit sector completed the treasury with an adequate development of the new law. As you may know, not in all the countries non-profit are under the anti-money laundering law, but is the case in Spain. So we are with other sectors as lawyers, financial institutions, or real estate owners, for example. At the same time, a little bit time after, in 2012, Spanish Treasury carried out a risk assessment. I mean, it was a kind of risk assessment because Treasury required AF from the beginning any kind of information about the sector. So we will engage with the Treasury from the beginning, but in fact, we could provide them with data about the number of the foundations, the economic dimension, areas and countries. And in fact, what we think is that this was not a real risk assessment. I mean, it was like a report on the sector, but we didn't get to any conclusion about the concrete risk of the Spanish non-profit sector. I used to see that this is the Achilles heel of the sector in Spain, but also in other countries regarding FATF evaluation and anti-money laundering legislation. At the same time, not at the same time, but 1 year later, a best practice recommendation were approved. They are really, well, they contain general and key principles, and well, we provided Treasury with some inputs from the sector on that kind of soft law too. But we state that there was a lack of concrete tools for implementing best practice, especially for reduced NPOs. No? So in fact, it's a guide and it's not a compulsory text of any kind of decree. Well, in April 2014 took place the on-site visit of FATF. They were, I think, a little bit more transparent, if I understood, than in the US, but they contact IF as a representative organization, and another, but just another international developing NGO. Evaluation or the face-to-face meeting, because it was an 1 hour face-to-face meeting with the evaluators, it was supposed to be focused on self-regulation tools of the sector, but in fact what they asked, it was for many questions about Spanish regulation of the sector, laws, decrees, and especially related to the registry and the supervisory system that we have in Spain, especially for public benefit association and foundation. They ask also about the mission and work of FATF, how we work as an umbrella organization, relationship with the public authorities, how we train our members, how we provide them with the information, and a little bit more around our activities and our mission with the sector. What was surprising is that I mean, 1 month after the on-site visit of FATF, a new decree developing the Anti-Money Laundering Act was approved. And it was approved, and it was, we considered that really restrictive for the sector, because it specifies some of the requirements. It contributes to have some more clearance, but for example, it states that a non-profit had to identify donors of more than 100 euros. So as you can imagine, that is in many cases really difficult. You can find the mutual report evaluation in the website of FATF as for other countries. And after this decree was approved, we could see the report on Spain. Regarding to recommendation 8, it states that Spain is largely compliant with R8. As you can imagine, if we consider that we have a restrictive regulation or a very detailed regulation regarding non-profit, I think it was normal that they consider that we are compliant with recommendation 8. You can see there that the Spanish authority have a sound understanding of the risk of the non-profit sector, and the requirements in place of NPOs were recently expanded, etc. Well, you can read there, but in fact, we still consider that we have not concrete where and how high or not is the risk of the Spanish sector, except in a few cases very determined. In the past or in the recent years, what we have experienced is not only an over-regulation, because we had it before the on-site visit of FATF, and just a month later, but what we have seen is an over-serious from supervising authorities on NPO. Some guidance have been approved for supervising authorities in Spain, but at the same time, supervising authorities have started asking many non-profits, for example, asking them for the list of donors and with other information, but in an indiscriminate way, we think, and absolutely not based on a risk approach. Okay, so, well, what has happened later as well? Well, registries and supervising authorities at the national level, we have different registries and supervising authorities. We used to have, I don't remember exactly how many, but around 10 or 12 supervising authorities and registries. And since 2015, we had just one registry and one supervisory authority. In fact, it was a demand of the sector since 1994, but anyway, we think that the FATF evaluation has, well, is related with that. And paradoxically, we have, while we have a restrictive regulation on anti-money laundering measures, we have a generous treatment for reduced donations that were put in force in 2015. What are we doing now? And I just finalized. Well, what we are doing is continue engagement with the public authorities, especially with the Treasury. We have formed a working group. It's like, our little coalition in Spain, something like that, which is formed by AEF, by UNICEF, Spanish Red Cross, Foundation for Blind People, and some corporate foundation, as Telefonica Foundation or Repsol Foundations. We have carried out our own risk assessment based on a survey. I mean, it's a little risk assessment. It's not an ambitious work, but our survey was answered in the last month by 300 non-profits. And we asked them about their size or things like the countries and fields where they develop their activities, the origin of their resources, and other things that we consider that are important for all the sectors, not only for non-profit sectors, and is what kind of financial channels and instruments they use. I mean, if they use transfers, credit cards, PayPal, cash, because I think that FAFT and almost Spanish authorities, they think that we manage money in cash, and that's not right. I mean, it's just a very tiny amount of resources of the sector. At the same time, we have formulated a consultation to the Treasury. It has ended in a resolution that resolves some doubts of application based on the day-to-day experience of NPO, and that has brought some clarification and certain, I mean, degree of the risking. And I don't know how are other European countries, but in Spain, the directive on anti-money laundering and financial terrorism has been not transposed. I mean, we are doing it just those days. So the Spanish Treasury has opened a public consultation. We have contributed with proposals from the sector, including an amendment and a concrete for the internal act, and we have based them on three arguments. First, that NPOs are not specified under directive. Well, for them and for European authorities and countries of European Union, that is not really relevant, but it's a fact. And the European Commission, in their risk assessment, they found a significant risk, but depending on different factors. And one of them was the registration. And we have asked for a new wording for the law, which states simplified due diligence measures, except improve high-risk situation. And finally, we are working at the same time in a good practice guide for the sector, trying to help them how to identify the risk, okay, according to the variety of the Spanish NPO sector, and trying to provide them with concrete measures to mitigate these risks that arise in their activity. Well, with this quick description of the process in Spain, I hope I have contributed to give some light on the effects on evaluation process and how we have tried to engage with our treasury. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. That was a very illustrative picture of how you engage also around advocacy policy, but also around kind of good practice development, good practice guide development, and own thinking of the sector of potentially analyzing and addressing the risk. So thank you very much. I would now like to move to our third and last country case study, which comes from Miguel de la Vega from Mexico. He works as a consultant for the NPO sector, and he will share a little bit the experience of Mexican CSOs related to the FATF policy. And we know that the just now recent FATF plenary was already looking at the country evaluation report of Mexico, which is not yet shared with externals, but Mexico has just been undergone country evaluation. So please, Miguel, the floor is yours of sharing some insights into how the Mexican NPO sector deals with the issue.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone from Mexico City. I'm sharing these facts on Mexico. As was mentioned before, the mutual evaluation was conducted this year, so the case I'm going to present has to do more on what experiences can we share regarding post-evaluation actions from civil society. Some of us engage in this process after the evaluation has taken place, such is our case. And there are many things that still can be done. Even though we don't know the results of the mutual evaluation, we do have some facts and some practices that I would like to share with you. I'm going to be very brief. This is the framework. The framework are mainly based on the government request for donors' information regarding money laundering. In particular, the government is concerned about money laundering coming from criminal activities. So they have issued a new law, the anti-money laundering law in 2014. Is the last version, and what they are doing is that they are requesting specific information as from certain limits of donations. When you get or you surpass this limit of donation, either if the donation is national or international, then you have to get some information and deliver that to the government. The problem that most organizations face is that the information requested sometimes violates the privacy of the donors and are considered against the law in some other countries. Information such as who's the legal representative of that foundation, or even requesting a copy of the ID of the donor is not very well taken in international foundations. So sometimes organizations are very concerned about failing, because failing to comply, and that's my second point, if they fail to comply, there are heavy fines, financial fines on the organizations if they are not able to comply with this information. So either or they get information or they are forced to reject grants when information is not complete. This has been the case in some organizations working with international donors. This is particularly important because some of the donations, as may be the case in your countries, are supporting work on human rights, democracy, citizenship, public policy advocacy. So even though we recognize that the government is worried, genuinely worried about money laundering, this can also be used as a means to obstacle the activities of nonprofits regarding financial regulation. That's on the public side. On the private side is the banking restrictions. The banking restrictions are gradually excluding organizations, especially from the risking practices. One of the main issues here was the HSBC bank scandal in 2012, which was, I guess, the biggest scandal of money laundering of this corporation in the world that happened here. They receive a huge historical fine in the U.S. but also created a lot of concern on banks regarding their vulnerability to money laundering. So gradually, the banks, especially the main ones and the big ones, are starting to exclude organizations not based on an open policy, but more on imposing requisites that are hard to complain, on delaying the applications. So the nonprofits are starting to go more to smaller banks in order to have some financial inclusion. This is not necessarily based on government policy, but also on private policies that we need to address. So one of the main process of learnings that we conduct is that not all the restrictions for civil society come from the government. There are some other restrictions that also come from the private sector, and this is the case with banks. So finally, to end up the framework, there was a risk assessment published in 2016. I'm not sure if it's there's an English translation, but it's in Spanish. It concluded that even though it was not focused on NGOs and it has a very small comments on civil society, it has a very powerful conclusion at the end, because it says that Mexican CSOs, they don't face any risk whatsoever of finance to terrorism, which is very important because this figure is being used in the region, especially in Brazil and Argentina, as a figure to label organizations that are activists as related with finance to terrorism. So the fact that Mexican civil society organizations are not labeled like this is a great advance. But still, the government identify us as low risk of money laundering, which is closer to new recommendation 8, but still is not reflected on legislation and public policy. Now, on the next slide, what we have is what have we done? And this is something that I want to share with you, especially considering the fact that we had to engage post-evaluation. What we did is divided in 3 specific strategies. The first one is to articulate, but the articulation has to be done not only among civil society. One of our main strategies was diversity. In order to address these issues, we need to include civil society organizations, academics, activists, networks, media, and the list is still short. I need to include also some banking officers, even some public officers that are aware of these situations, are interested into acting in order to diminish the restrictions to civil society. So articulation based on diversity of sectors is one of the issues that we have been engaging. Our network is called Unidos, and it means together for the rights of civil society, and this articulation that is based on this diversity. Second, we conducted analysis, but the analysis and the diagnosis we conducted is not conducted on an academic focus or only on the provision of knowledge. The research efforts, they have advocacy as objective. They are conducted for advocacy. Their main focus, their main objective is advocacy. So it's easier if the networks start developing some research efforts that are used as base for the design of proposals, and especially if it's possible through pro bono technical advice. What I mean is this: when we are dealing with legislations, not all civil society organizations have the experience of the knowledge, of the technical knowledge, in order to build proposals that are actually have technical viability. If we are focusing on changing the law, it's very important to include pro bono technical advice from lawyers, from accountants, from financial analysts, in order to provide these proposals with with solid background, and it's also appealing for the government. And finally, our strategy means is focused not only on advocacy, but also to strengthen civil society. So what we're doing on a local scale is to disseminate the restrictions derived from FATF and also formation through workshops on making organizations conscious about what's going on and how can they deal with this, and also what are the strategies in order to cope with these situations. So finally, with the last slide, the last slide what I introduced were the internal strategies of organizations. Now of organization. Now, the external strategies are based also on 3 different dimensions. The first one is mapping, which is we try to map different actors in order to build dialogue based on 2 criteria. First one is the capacity to make decisions, and second, the affinity or the opposition to civil society interests. Second, to build pressure. In order to build pressure, we use media, social networks, but also traditional media as well. Social networks, digital networks have been very useful, but also use traditional media. We published a big letter signed by more than 500 civil society organizations expressing concerns on financial and tax restrictions last December, and we published that on paper, on 2 of our main national papers, and that created a huge concern on governments. So public image is important, even though this may not be the most attractive issues. But also, and this is the last part of the presentation, when we develop pressure, we don't close the door to dialogue. It's very important that we position the network as a network that is building pressure, but is also open for a permanent dialogue with authorities. So what we did is to establish temporary dialogue space, and I like to emphasize temporary because these dialogue spaces, they have to have an open, they have to have a start and a close-up in order to force the government to deliver responses to the requests by civil society. So we define specific times in order to have this dialogue with public officers. And to end up, we requested publicly that the government, we expect from the government a formal reply by the authorities to our concerns and our proposals. So to wrap up, what I believe is that it's possible to engage on post-evaluation processes, and what we suggest is to emphasize diverse articulation, to build technical proposals with support with pro bono experts, which may include private firms or universities, and to engage governments with a mixture of pressure and dialogue in these processes whenever possible, because I'm aware that certain governments are absolutely close to dialogue, and maybe the pressure would be the only strategy, but this is what's been going on in here. And I want to end up mentioning that what we envision for the future is not only the national action, but the regional action, because some issues also we need some pressure and dialogue from the regional offices. In our case, the Office for Latin America, GAFILAT, based in Argentina. So we are already building another network, smaller but with a larger scope, along with colleagues in Brazil and Argentina. I guess that's all from my side.
Okay, thank you very much, Miguel. This was very insightful, and I really liked also your kind of external strategy in finding the right mixture between pressure and dialogue. And indeed, that's something that we want to discuss with all participants of the call and the wider sector is indeed what are the issues that NPOs and philanthropy infrastructure organizations in particular should consider around this policy. Indeed, it's very important that you link up with other NPO players. It does not only affect philanthropic organizations, it impacts the whole NPO sector. And as Miguel and others have also stated, that it also is sometimes important to create links to other types of organizations, such as the banks, engage in dialogues with unusual suspects, and try also to develop coalition around certain issues of common concern across the sectors. So that's definitely very important. Around the FATF policy implementation at the national level, it is of course very important for infrastructure organizations to engage with your governments around the risk assessment, around the risk mitigation measures, even before the evaluation. I think that the other speakers also stressed the importance to engage early on in this process. Then, of course, when it comes to the FATF country evaluation, it is important that the sector is well prepared, is aware of potential own risks, is aware and knowledgeable around own legislation, about self-regulation, and does also consider own risk analysis. I mean, we heard the case from Spain where the sector is now doing an own sector risk analysis, and in Switzerland we were made aware that there was also some own sector risk analysis. So these are indeed steps to consider also by the philanthropic infrastructure organizations. And clearly, as Miguel just also said, it's kind of post-evaluation is also important, because after an evaluation is before the next evaluation. So indeed, the money laundering and counterterrorism financing policy is ongoing work that governments are following, and that the sector should also be concerned about to ensure that measures in place are proportionate and do not unduly restrict the activities of NPOs. Now, how can you engage around this process? I mean, clearly, you're welcome to join the Global NPO Coalition. There is an email that can be sent to the following email address of the NPO Coalition. We have created a specific online platform also where you find information on bank de-risking, on financial inclusion, but also on the FATF policy, on country evaluations, a variety of issues related to this topic. You find a lot of information there. You can also, of course, disseminate this information, encourage your membership, the wider sector to engage around this process. Do please inform us also as NPO Global Coalition if you're aware of research, if you're aware of national developments, either restrictions introduced, but also good practice developed either by the sector or by governments. It's important to also illustrate where it works well, where meaningful policy is in place. As I said, engage with your governments. That's very important as much as possible around these issues. And clearly also see to engage in the international policy development. As I said earlier, we have been successfully advocating for more formalized dialogue with FATF and for having more seats for the NPO sector in the so-called private sector consultative forum, and use the connections with those having the seats for the NPO sector process.
Hanna?
So,
okay.
Yeah?
Your audio was not. No, your audio was cutting, but now it's fine. Sorry, you can go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So how you can engage? So I wanted to spend not very long, because I'm conscious that we are running out of time. But I wanted to just briefly inform you that indeed the private sector consultative forum from the Financial Action Task Force is one of the larger panels where FATF engages with other sectors, with businesses, professions, financial sector representatives, but also with civil society and the NPOs. And we have now been successfully advocating for more seats. And as from EFC, on behalf of WINGS, we have one seat for now for the philanthropic sector. So I've been attending the Spring 2017 Private Sector Consultative Forum meeting on behalf of WINGS, and we also organized a specific event as a side event, specifically focusing on NPOs, on FATF evaluations and risk assessments. And here we had more NPOs participating. So some of you on the call, I know, have also been participating in this event in Spring 2017. I do not have the time to go into all the details of this year's FATF Private Consultative Forum meeting, but the global priorities that were addressed in this meeting, they relate to financial inclusion, bank de-risking issues, and potential ways to address this. We also had the possibility of one of the co-chairs of the NPO coalition to present the work that we are doing within this sector consultative forum meeting. Priorities were also from our side around the implementation of recommendation 8, which was kind of presented in this webinar. We also mentioned the need for training of evaluators, also specifically with regard to recommendation 8, so that they are knowledgeable about, more knowledgeable about the NPO sector. And we were also stressing that other recommendations do also have an impact on the NPO sector, on our sector, in particular recommendation 24, 25, which deal with this question of who is the beneficial owner of legal entities and trusts. Then the 4 NPO representatives attending the Spring 2017 event, they were participating, or we were participating in all the different workshops that took place during these 1.5 days. And the focus were on different issues. One was on FinTech and RegTech, which is basically the kind of the financial service industry, is how they deal with kind of customer engagement and how they use new technologies around that. Specifically, this is an area where small startups are working. RegTech refers then to how regulators are also using new technologies in terms of dealing with data and reporting issues. So this was debated in the Private Sector Consultative Forum, and FATF made clear that they are aware of these new developments and they want to also be on top of these new developments. They do consider them as a great opportunity and a tool for themselves as well, but of course they would also like to address certain risks related to these new technology tools. There were also sessions on risk indicators, on financial inclusion, which then focused on financial inclusion of individuals, but we as NPOs were also able in the conversations of the Private Sector Consultative Forum to raise awareness of that the financial inclusion and the de-risking is happening also of parts of the NPO sector, so this was raised also in these meetings. There were also sessions on correspondent banking, that there is some more policy work developed around correspondent banking. We were also talking about transparency questions around legal entities, legal structures, corporate structures, specifically the question of publication of beneficial ownership and collection of beneficial ownership information of legal entities and trusts. And of course here the question that was also raised by Isabel is indeed how does this apply to the non-profit sector who does not really have beneficial owners as such, because NPOs tend to benefit the general public. And the question is, how do these policy rules then apply to the non-profit sector? So you can see there is a huge variety of policy issues that is generally discussed during the FATF Private Sector Consultative Forum meeting, going far beyond also the recommendation 8 itself. And hence we consider it's very crucial and important that we do have more representation with these 4 seats in the Private Sector Consultative Forum. And we also want to use the opportunity of such webinars as this to encourage that you come back to us if you have any specific issues that you would like to see raised in such meetings, that we would be able to also bring this to the attention to the FATF. The full note of the Spring 2017 event that was prepared by the NPO Coalition and the 4 NPOs participating can be accessed on the website of the NPO Coalition of the FATF platform, and I gave you the link in this slide. Now we are already heading towards the next meeting of the Private Sector Consultative Forum to take place in Spring 2018. And while the 4 NPOs will again be able to participate the whole event of the Private Sector Consultative Forum, we are also in conversation with the FATF Secretariat to again co-organize a specific NPO workshop as a satellite event. So we are proposing to do potentially an event on de-risking and how to address the issue of bank de-risking through multi-stakeholder engagement or other. So this is one of the proposals of issues that we would like to discuss at the next Private Sector Consultative Forum. And then we would also like to continue the conversation around the implementation of Recommendation 8 to make sure that NPOs are engaged in this process, and also to put more emphasis on the risk assessment, how it is done, and how NPOs can engage around the risk assessment that is undertaken on the NPO sector. We also raised the issue of the Recommendation 2425 and its application to the NPO sector as an issue of concern to us. We have also engaged with the FATF Secretariat on kind of pursuing our additional asks towards the Financial Action Task Force. That is that we recommend that there is more guidance of how NPOs can engage and consult in the process, and also what I raised earlier, a need for specific training of the evaluators with the revised Recommendation 8 to ensure that this risk-based and targeted approach is indeed taken into account. So here again, this is the encouragement to all of you to be engaged, stay engaged, and let us know if we can kind of submit your own points of concern also towards this platform.